Hey all, how are you tonight? Are you ready for a little Texas history? Yeah, I can imagine you're saying, oh, not history. Okay, here it goes. Open range in Texas, and Texas. Now, why is that important, open range in Texas? Very simply because the open range in Texas had to do with the fact that cattle was king around the 1870s, 1870, 1880, 1890, thereabouts. And for that time, Texas was the place where they literally moved thousands of head of cattle across the state to stockyards and other places to sell off the animals for beef and for other products. And this was important because it was a huge part of the Texas economy. So Texas was big on cattle. Cattle, as the saying goes, was king. Well, these cattle, of course, were owned by ranchers who owned large acres of land, and they used that land to, of course, feed their cattle and to make sure they were cared for and to make sure all the cattle was taken care of. And then when it was ready, what they did was they would start walking cattle, but the cattle would be started to move across the state, and the purpose was to feed them. They would graze, they would eat, they would drink water, and they would go across the state until they got to that stockyard where they would be sold. Well, in the process of moving across the state, they found themselves being guided by cowboys. Oh, and by the way, one other thing I might point out to you: cattle drives began after the Civil War. That's a good time frame to remember. Cattle drives began after the Civil War. I said between 1870 and 1890. Some may go as far back as around 1865. Cattle drives began after the Civil War, and it was a big part of the economy of Texas. Lots of ranchers made lots of money selling those cattle. So it was a big part of the economy of Texas. Now, we've heard the stories of cowboys. We've heard about cowboys. Big part of the economy of Texas, okay? We've heard about cowboys. Now, what is it about cowboys that we know about? We usually watch the movies and read the books about these men who were just, maybe gunslingers, and they were in constant brawls in the city, or they were taking on each other in big fights, and there'd be big challenges. Well, really, the cowboy was kind of a low-key fellow who worked very hard. He was very diligent, very focused on making sure that the cattle got across the state. They were night and day workers. In fact, many of them had Mexican roots because that's where they came from. They got into the whole idea of cattle and training animals and just that kind of agricultural culture. So some were Mexicans, some were African Americans, former slaves. And so as a result, they were the ones that gave a very special flavor to the cattle drives. They were special people. They were special because they were hardworking. They were on task all the time. They were making the move happen. Now, one thing we ought to know also about the cattle move is that because it went across because it went across the state, the cattle literally was eating on other people's land. I mean, you have these thousands of heads of cattle, and they're moving across the state, and there's people who own land who are finding all these animals on their land, and they're eating their crops. So that didn't sit over too well. So there was a guy named Joseph Glidden. He was a farmer in Illinois who came up with a brilliant idea. He created something called barbed wire, where farmers could go ahead and wire up around their areas so that the cattle would know that there was a boundary. Now you say, why barbed wire? Because wooden fences were just so easy to crack down. I mean, look, these animals are big. They're huge. They weigh a lot, and they're strong. And the wood just wouldn't help at all. They just crash through the wood without any problem. So they've got the barbed wire, which was stronger. It made a better boundary, and it kept the animals out. Well, at least for a while, until the ranch owners, I should say, who were trying to make money off these cattle, got a little bit upset And as a result, they started fighting the small farmers. That's when they had these things called range war or range wars. Range wars right here. Range wars. Okay? Range wars. And that's where you had these ranchers that were wanting to make a whole lot of money, and they went ahead and fought. And there was gunfire. There was people killing people. They're saying, "Get off my land," because they didn't want the cattle taking the food away, but the cattle had to eat. So it was a tense period of time for a couple years or for a few years because the farmers wanted to keep their land protected and the ranchers wanted to move their cattle, and so there was a lot of conflict there. Well, guess what? Something else happened that really changed the whole culture. If you guessed the railroad, you got it. See, what happened with the railroad was the railroad provided a way to transport the cattle. They could be put on the cars and sent to market. That way, they didn't have to run across the land. And so during the late 1800s, 1880s, you started to see fewer and fewer cattle drives. One, because of the railroads, also because of the weather. They had a few cold winters that year, and that kind of messed up the agriculture of the land and also made it harder to drive the cattle. Secondly, there were some droughts. And if you have drought, there's no water. No water, cattle can't move. Cattle can't move, there's no cattle drive. So the weather changed things and the railroads changed things. But for a time, the open range in Texas was an open range. Lots of cattle moving, lots of profit being made, selling those cattle, making the economy in Texas boom. But like everything else, there's a boom time and there's a time of bust. There's a time when certain things happen, like the range, open range, and the range wars, and a time when it all dies down because of new technology, and that new technology was the railroad. So there you have it. It's a summary, a brief summary, but gives you an idea what it means when you think of the open range in Texas. See you later. Well, not as many this time, but that's okay. Mom?